So obviously another big aspect of the Industrial Revolution is the booming economy that came along with it. And the economy was really, really good for people to make a whole lot of money. It was also kind of rough for the people who were not making money. Today, what we're going to talk about is those people who were making a lot of the money. So our guiding question for this particular unit, who were the robber barons and how did they make their money? So I want you to keep this question in mind as we proceed throughout the next few slides. So before we get too far into the robber barons and how they made their money, it's really important for us to understand the economic system in the United States. And this is just a really brief overview of that economic system. There are entire classes and entire majors that are set aside for the economy and the study of the economy. So like I said, this is just a really brief overview. So we have a free enterprise system in the United States. And that is an economic system that allows people to start up their own businesses or to make their own, to have their own ideas, to own their own properties. Okay, that's a system that we have always had in the United States. And that seems like it would be the system everywhere, but it's definitely not. We're lucky to be a part of that type of society. Human resources are people who are employed by a company. They contribute to the production of the goods and services that are going on within that company. There are entire jobs and careers based on hiring and firing. Those are your human resources type of people. Then you've got your capital resources. Your capital resources are your machines, the equipment, the money that's set aside to help produce those goods and services as well. And then you have your consumer. We're all consumers. We are people who buy the goods and the services. So what is a robber baron exactly? A robber baron was somebody during the Industrial Revolution who was a powerful businessman or financial investor. Most of the time they were multi-millionaires. They, a lot of times, were considered to have become wealthy by exploiting natural resources or using those natural resources, or by some other, maybe considered unfair or dishonest method. There are several that were really famous in American history. Andrew Carnegie was steel production. We have Jay Gould, who was a financier. We have J.P. Morgan, who was a financier. We have John D. Rockefeller, who was oil, and we have Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was railroads. A couple of those names are probably very familiar to you because you hear buildings and all kinds of things named after them today. Rockefeller Center, Carnegie Hall. The Vanderbilts owned the Biltmore Estate. J.P. Morgan is still a famous institution that's around today. So these are all people who had a really big impact on our lives today. So Andrew Carnegie is the first one that I want us to really pay a lot of attention to. Andrew Carnegie was a steel man. So during his lifetime, there was a new process of making steel. It was called the Bessemer process. And this process basically helped to make things a lot cheaper. Before we had the Bessemer process, that process of making steel was super expensive, okay? And since it was so expensive, a lot of machinery had to be made out of iron. And iron is very heavy and difficult to work with. So once Carnegie got this whole idea of the Bessemer process, he was able to open up a very profitable steel mill in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Steelers, all should be familiar to you. So he was able to control this Bessemer process and the entire process of not only purifying this steel, but shipping it to people and all of the different steps along the line. That helped him to become one of the wealthiest people in American history. He was able to retire at a significantly early age, and he put a lot of his money towards helping out the community. So he was a philanthropist, somebody that helps the community out. And just to kind of give you an idea of how wealthy he truly was, starting in 1870, the United States produced about 68,000 tons of steel in a year. By 1900, the U.S. produced more than 10 million tons of steel a year, okay? And 90% of that was coming from Andrew Carnegie. So he had a huge control of that market. And keep in mind too that we're going to start to see steel used in buildings and vehicles and all kinds of construction. So he is going to be the leader of that process of basically helping to build lots of America. John D. Rockefeller, he was an oil person. In 1859, there's going to be a hole drilled in western Pennsylvania. Oil comes from the ground, and this is going to be the start of the United States oil industry, which is still a very large industry. We know that oil is used in the production of kerosene. Kerosene was used for oil lamps and automobiles. Before the light bulb and some of the other inventions we talked about, these oil lamps were used in every single household. So Rockefeller started Standard Oil Company, which was an oil refinery. Basically, it took that raw oil from the ground and helped to refine it to make it possible to be used in these lamps and the automobiles. Very similarly to Carnegie, Rockefeller controlled the entire process of getting the oil, refining the oil, and then distributing it to various companies who needed it. He also had almost 90% of the market under his control. So, the word monopoly comes to mind when we think of things like Standard Oil and Andrew Carnegie Steel, okay? A monopoly is a business that is able to charge really extremely high prices because there's no competition in the market. We don't see a lot of monopolies today because they are illegal based on how much money these men were able to make off of their companies. Only example that sometimes I think you hear people talking about is in Raleigh specifically, we've got Time Warner Cable, and they seem to be the only cable carrier, so they can charge some higher prices. But we have more cable companies moving into Raleigh now, so it's not even nearly to the extreme that Standard Oil would have been. So in a monopoly, customers are forced to make the decision as to whether they want to pay that really high price for a good or service or to just go without it. Obviously, because these men became so wealthy, the majority of Americans chose and almost had to go along with buying things like steel and oil. So that's it for our discussion about monopolies and robber barons. Make sure that you get these notes taken in class today so that you're prepared for your activity tomorrow. Have a great one.